The blizzard hit without warning on the 3rd day of November, 1882, and Sarah Talmadge realized she was going to die alone in the Wyoming Territory if she did not find shelter within the next 20 minutes. She had been riding hard since dawn, pushing her buckskin mare through the gray-bellied sky that had been threatening all morning, trying to make it to the town of Caldwell Creek before the storm broke. The distance had seemed manageable when she had set out from the Hendricks homestead that morning, where she had spent 2 nights nursing old Mabel Hendricks through a fever. Sarah was the closest thing Caldwell Creek had to a doctor, though the townspeople never called her that, because women did not get called doctors in 1882, not even when they were the only person within 40 miles who knew how to set a broken leg or brew a proper willow bark tincture. They called her the Widow Talmadge, and they were grateful enough for her hands when they needed them. But now those capable hands were numb inside her leather gloves, and the wind had turned vicious in a matter of minutes, screaming down from the north with a fury that seemed almost personal. The snow was not falling so much as it was being thrown horizontally, stinging her face like broken glass, and she could barely see 3 feet in front of her horse's nose. The mare, her name was Copper, and she was the most sensible creature Sarah had ever known, had slowed to a walk and was tossing her head with a kind of terrified purpose, as though she understood the stakes better than any human could. Sarah leaned low over Copper's neck and squinted through the white madness, looking for anything. A stand of trees, a rock face, any kind of windbreak at all. That was when she saw the cabin. It was barely visible through the churning snow, just a dark rectangular shape hunched against the hillside like something ashamed of itself. But it was solid, and it was real, and she drove Copper toward it without thinking twice. The mare needed no urging. She lunged forward with a kind of desperate gratitude, and within minutes they had reached the small structure. It was a 1-room trapper's cabin, the logs chinked with dried mud that was crumbling in places, a stone chimney stack rising from one end with a rusted iron stovepipe. A lean-to shed was attached to the south side, barely standing but intact enough to offer a horse some protection from the wind. Sarah got Copper settled in the lean-to as best she could, pulling a rough wool blanket from her saddlebag and throwing it over the mare's shaking flanks, tying her loosely so she could move. She carried her saddlebags inside and pushed the cabin door open with her shoulder. The smell hit her first: wood smoke, tobacco, and something else, something warm and alive. The cabin was not empty. There was a man lying on the narrow rope bed against the far wall, and he was in a bad way. He was tall, she could tell that even lying down, with dark hair matted with sweat plastered to his forehead, and a jaw rough with several days of stubble. He wore a flannel shirt and canvas trousers, his boots still on, and he was shivering so violently that the ropes beneath the thin mattress were creaking with the force of it. On the small table beside the bed sat a tin cup and a lamp burning low, and near the iron stove in the corner there was a small pile of wood that would not last the night. He opened his eyes when she came in, eyes that were dark brown and shot through with fever-bright intensity, and he said in a voice like gravel and rust, "If you are a hallucination, you are the most welcome one I have ever had." Sarah set her saddlebags down and crossed the room in 4 strides and pressed her bare hand to his forehead before she had even properly looked at his face. "You are burning up," she said. "I am aware," he said. "How long have you been like this?" 2 days, maybe 3. I lost track. He tried to sit up and failed, and the effort seemed to cost him something. He sank back against the thin pillow with a kind of controlled surrender. "There is water in the bucket near the stove. The creek outside is frozen solid, but I had enough to fill it before I could not go back out." Sarah was already moving. She found the bucket, found a relatively clean cloth hanging on a peg near the door, soaked it in the cold water and brought it back to press against his forehead. He closed his eyes, and the sound he made was not quite a word, but it was plainly grateful. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jasper Hunter," he said. "I am a cattle hand, or I was, until 3 days ago when my horse threw me and I made the poor decision to try to walk back to town." He paused. "I found this place by luck. Same luck I seem to have, Sarah said. She was already digging through her saddlebags with her other hand, pulling out the small collection of remedies she always carried. Dried elderflower and yarrow for fever. A small tin of pine resin salve. Her thermometer, a proper one, glass and mercury, which had cost her more than she cared to think about. I am Sarah Talmadge. I am from Caldwell Creek, and you have a very high fever, Mr. Hunter. I had noticed, he said again, but there was a ghost of humor in it that she found surprisingly reassuring. Delirious men did not make jokes. Difficult ones did. Are you hurt anywhere besides the fever? When your horse threw you, did you break anything? He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. My right shoulder. I do not think it is broken, badly bruised. She checked it efficiently, running practiced fingers along the joint and collarbone while he held himself very still and did not make a sound, though she could see the tension in his jaw. Nothing broken. She said so. Good, he said. The wind outside had become something biblical. It shook the cabin walls like a living thing, and Sarah could feel cold air pressing through the gaps in the chinking. She spent the next hour in fierce, focused activity, stoking the stove with the wood that remained, packing some of the worst gaps in the walls with strips of cloth from her extra petticoat, brewing a fever tea with the dried herbs from her bag using melted snow on the stovetop, and taking stock of the food situation, which was not encouraging. Jasper had a flour sack with a little cornmeal, some dried beans, a small piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a tin of lard, and a handful of coffee. She had in her own bags a second cloth-wrapped piece of hard bread, some dried apple rings, a small paper twist of salt, and, thankfully, a good supply of medicinal herbs. It was not going to be comfortable, but they were not going to starve. She got the fever tea into him by persistence more than anything else, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding the cup while he drank, and he drank because she gave him a look that suggested not drinking was not a reasonable option. He managed about half before he fell back against the pillow again. You are not from around here, he said, studying her face with those fevered eyes. I came from Missouri, she said. 4 years ago now. What brought you out here? She hesitated for only a moment. The wind howled, the stove ticked with heat. My husband, she said. He wanted land, we came out together. He died the second winter influenza. She said it plainly, as she always did, because she had learned that the plain version of grief was easier to carry than the ornate one. I stayed because by then I had nowhere else to go, and because the people here needed someone who understood medicine. Jasper was quiet for a moment. I am sorry, he said, and he said it simply and directly without the fumbling apology that most people offered her, the kind that was really about their own discomfort with the word widow. He just said he was sorry, and it sounded like he meant exactly that and nothing more. Thank you, she said. Where are you from? She asked, because fair was fair. Texas originally, he said. Came north with a cattle drive 3 years ago and decided I liked the territory. Hired on with the Rocking H outfit about 15 miles east of Caldwell Creek. He paused, and she could see him fighting to stay awake against the pull of the fever. I do not have a wife or a family nearby, in case you were wondering who would come looking. She raised an eyebrow at that. I was not wondering. No, he said, but I thought you might need to know in case. He did not finish the sentence, but she understood it. In case things got worse, in case no one was coming. I was not expecting rescue anyway, she said crisply. Rest now, Mr. Hunter, you need to sleep. He slept. She did not. She sat in the single wooden chair by the stove and listened to the blizzard dismantle the world outside, feeding wood into the stove in small, careful amounts, watching her supply dwindle and running calculations in her head. The cabin was cold despite the stove, not dangerously cold, not yet, but cold enough that her breath made small ghosts in the air. She kept her coat on and wrapped herself in a second blanket she found folded on a high shelf, and she watched the firelight play across Jasper Hunter's sleeping face and listened to the storm with a feeling she recognized as something very close to peace, despite everything. She had not felt that in a long time. By midnight, his fever had climbed higher and she had to wake him to get more tea into him, and he woke disoriented and gripped her wrist with a strong hand and said something she did not catch. And when she said his name quietly and steadily, he came back to himself with visible effort and released her wrist. "Sorry," he said. "Do not apologize," she said. "It is the fever. Drink this." He drank. He lay back. His hand, she noticed, had not been frightening, only strong, reflexive, entirely without aggression. It was the grip of a man who was used to hard work and harder ground, who held on to things because he had learned that things could be taken away. She knew something about that. The second day of the blizzard was no better than the first. If anything, it was worse. The snow was piling against the cabin door to a depth that made opening it an athletic endeavor, and the cold had hardened into something merciless and still. She went out once briefly to check on Copper and found the mare surviving in the lean-to, pressed against the side of the cabin where the accumulated snow had actually formed a kind of insulating wall. She brought a little water and a handful of feed from the small supply hanging in a canvas bag on the lean-to's post. Someone had stocked it, probably Jasper before he fell ill, and Copper pressed her warm nose into Sarah's cold palm with a gratitude that was almost heartbreaking. Inside, Jasper's fever broke sometime around noon on the second day. She knew it by the way the shivering changed its character, became looser and less violent, and then by the sweat that soaked through his shirt and the slight easing of the drawn tension around his eyes and mouth. She changed the cloth on his forehead and he looked up at her with eyes that were clearer than they had been and said, "I think I am going to live." "I expect so," she said, keeping her voice professionally cool. "You have been up the whole time," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been aware of more than he let on. "I slept some," she said, which was true in the way that sitting in a chair and closing your eyes for 45 minutes was technically sleeping. He looked at her steadily and did not argue with that, but the look said enough. He had noticing eyes, she was realizing. The kind of eyes that picked up details without making a production of it. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Can you sit up?" He tried and this time managed it, swinging his legs over the side of the bed with some effort. He was very pale, and there was a gauntness around his face that the fever had carved there, but the clarity was back in his eyes and he was clearly determined not to be useless. "The wood supply is low," she said. "There is more," he said. "Around the back of the cabin under a canvas. I did not have the chance to bring it in before I got sick." She looked at the door beyond which the blizzard was screaming. "I will get it," she said. "You will not," he said and stood up, wavering only slightly. "I have boots on already. Hand me my coat." She started to argue and he gave her a look that was not unkind but was entirely unyielding, and she found herself handing him his coat. She helped him into it. His shoulder was still paining him. She could see, and she watched him put on his hat and gloves with the precise movements of a man conserving energy. And then he opened the door and a wall of white madness attempted to enter the cabin and he fought it back with his body and went out. He was back in 8 minutes. He made 3 trips over the next half hour, bringing armloads of wood that he stacked beside the stove with a quiet, methodical care. And by the time he was done, she had hot coffee ready and she handed him a cup without ceremony, and he took it and they stood by the stove together drinking it in a silence that felt, to her considerable surprise, entirely natural. "How long do you think it will last?" she asked, meaning the storm. 2 more days at least, he said, looking at the crack of white light at the top of the door. "Maybe 3. November blizzards in this territory, they do not stop to ask your opinion." "I have enough herbs for the fever if it comes back," she said. "And the food will stretch. I can set a snare," he said. "Tomorrow, if the wind drops even a little, I have wire in my saddlebag." She had not thought of that and she was honest enough to be impressed by it. "You can set snares. My father was a trapper before he was a cattle man," he said. "I know 20 ways to catch a rabbit and only about 3 of them are worth knowing." There was that ghost of humor again, brief and dry and appealing. She found herself almost smiling, which surprised her. They made cornmeal mush for supper that evening, which was humble fare but was hot and filling, and they sat at the small table across from each other and ate with the practical concentration of two people who were not yet comfortable enough for idle conversation, but who had passed some invisible threshold of mutual trust. The stove threw warm orange light across the small space, and outside the wind had dropped by perhaps a quarter, enough that the cabin walls no longer shuddered quite so violently. "What did your husband do?" Jasper asked after a while, and there was nothing intrusive in the way he asked it. It was curiosity offered openly, easily refused if she wanted to refuse it. She did not want to. "He was a farmer," she said. "Daniel was a good man. He believed in this territory the way some men believe in God with his whole chest. He thought we could build something real out here." She turned the tin cup in her hands. "He was right about the territory. He was just not able to stay long enough to build it." Jasper nodded. "I am sorry he did not get to see what you have built instead." She looked up at that. It was not what most people said. Most people said what a shame or what a hard lot or some variation of how brave she had been. Nobody said that. "What about you?" she said. "Have you ever come close to something like that? A life in one place with someone?" He was quiet for a moment and she could see him deciding how much to give. "Once," he said finally. "There was a woman in Abilene 4 years back. Her name was Clara. She was a school teacher." He paused. "She went back east to care for her mother and she married a man from Ohio. I do not blame her. The territory is a hard place to ask someone to stay." "It is," Sarah agreed. "But some of us stay anyway." "Some of you," he said, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, "are not the kind of people who leave." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And the fire popped and the wind continued its diminished complaint, and it was somehow not uncomfortable at all. On the third day, the wind dropped enough for him to set his snares in the thin stand of pine trees behind the cabin, moving carefully through knee-deep snow with the focused efficiency of a man who had been outdoors all his life. Sarah watched him from the doorway and then went back inside and organized what remained of their food with the same fierce economy she applied to everything. The dried beans were soaking in meltwater. There was enough cornmeal for 2 more days of mush. The cheese was almost gone. He came back in half an hour later with snow in his eyebrows and a look of quiet satisfaction and said, "We will check them in the morning." They spent the afternoon in the particular intimacy of 2 strangers sharing a small space, which requires a different kind of negotiation than most people expect. Sarah had her medical kit spread on the table and was taking stock and reorganizing, labeling tiny paper packets with careful script. Jasper had found, in a corner of the cabin, a collection of old newspapers left by whoever had built the place. A Wyoming paper from 2 summers past, and several issues of a Kansas newspaper from even further back. He read them with the absorbed attention of someone for whom news, however old, was a luxury, occasionally reading aloud a headline that struck him as interesting. "Listen to this," he said, paper rustling. "July 1880, Dodge City, a man attempted to rob the Long Branch Saloon and was foiled by the bartender with a bung starter." He looked up. "A bung starter. A barrel stopper," Sarah said without looking up from her labels. "Used as a weapon against an armed man." He folded the paper with a kind of reverent appreciation. "There is courage in the world, Miss Talmadge." "Mrs. Talmadge," she corrected automatically, and then felt, as she always did when she corrected it, the small, complicated weight of the title. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said, respectfully and without fuss. But she noticed in the peripheral of her attention that he set the newspaper down and spent a moment looking at the far wall with a thoughtful expression before picking it up again. The next morning they found a snowshoe hare in one of the snares, and Jasper dressed it outside with a practiced efficiency that she respected even as she was grateful not to watch, and she made a proper stew with it using the dried beans and the last of the salt. And they ate it that evening with a sense of genuine well-being that surprised her. It was as good a meal as she had eaten in months. He complimented it directly and without flattery, the way you compliment something you actually mean, and said it was the best stew he had tasted since his trail cook's last day with the drive, which had been 3 years ago. "What happened to the trail cook?" she asked. "He married a widow woman in Cheyenne and opened a boarding house," Jasper said. "Best decision he ever made by all accounts." There was a pause that was fractionally weighted, and then they both went back to their stew. It was on the fourth day that they truly began to talk. The storm was waning but not gone, still pressing down from the north with sullen persistence, the kind of weather that would not end dramatically but would slowly, grudgingly loosen its hold. They had checked the snares again, another hare, blessed the territory's wildlife, and there was enough food now to feel almost comfortable. Jasper's fever had not returned. His shoulder was healing. He moved around the small cabin with a kind of large, quiet ease that somehow did not crowd her the way she would have expected. They talked about the territory, about the cattle business which was changing, the open range was getting fenced, the big outfits were buying up land, and the days of the long drive were numbered. He said this without sentimentality, just honest observation. He had seen the same thing happen to the trail that the railroad happened to the wagon routes. "What will you do?" she asked. "When the cattle work changes." "I have been saving," he said. "I want a piece of land, not a big spread, just enough for a small herd and a decent kitchen garden. Something that is mine." He said this with a directness that she found refreshing, the absence of embarrassment about wanting something simple and real. "What about you? Will you always be the town's unofficial doctor who no one pays properly?" she said. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I was going to say the town's healer, but yes." "Yes," she said. "Probably, for a while at least. They need me and I need them. It is a fair enough arrangement." "You deserve more than fair," he said, and said it so naturally, so without artifice, that it hit her somewhere below her breastbone before she had time to deflect it. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know you well enough," he said. "You have been up for 4 days straight keeping a stranger alive in a blizzard. You packed your own clothing into the wall to keep out the cold. You are eating less than me so the food lasts longer, and you think I have not noticed, but I have." He said all of this evenly, without accusation. "I know the important things." She looked at him across the small table and felt something shift, the way the light shifts when a cloud moves off the sun, slow and warm and entirely certain. "Jasper Hunter," she said, "you are considerably more observant than you initially appear." "I try not to advertise it," he said, and there was that smile again, the real one, the one that appeared without warning and changed the whole geography of his face. She looked away first, and she was not sure why. On the 5th day the storm stopped. It did not end gracefully. It simply ran out of itself sometime before dawn, and when Sarah opened the cabin door at first light, the world had been remade in white and silence, the kind of absolute quiet that follows violence. The sky above was the clean, fierce blue of a Wyoming winter morning, the sun striking the snow with a brilliance that was almost painful, and the air was cold enough to crystallize in her lungs when she breathed in. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her hands on the doorframe and felt something she had not expected to feel, the first faint reluctance, because the storm being over meant the road being clear eventually. It meant rescue, or at least exit. It meant Caldwell Creek and her small house and her medical kit spread across its proper table and the familiar demands of her familiar life. All of which she wanted, all of which was good and real and hers. And yet, she stepped back inside and Jasper was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed pulling on his boots, and he looked up when she came in. "It stopped," he said. "It stopped," she confirmed. They looked at each other across the small, warm room, and something was said in that look that neither of them was ready to say out loud. The snow was too deep to travel that day. They both knew it without discussing it. The drifts along what passed for a road were chest-high in places, and Copper, while recovering beautifully, needed another day before Sarah would feel comfortable riding her hard in deep snow. This was the practical reality, and they stated it practically, and neither of them mentioned the other thing, which was that neither of them was quite ready. Instead, they spent the day in an entirely different kind of warmth. The sun was blazing through the small window on the south wall of the cabin, throwing a long rectangle of gold across the plank floor, and Sarah dragged the single chair into it and sat there with her face tipped up like a cat. And Jasper sat on the floor near the stove with his back against the wall, long legs stretched out, and they talked for hours. He told her about Texas, about the sound of a thunderstorm rolling across flat land where there was nothing between you and the horizon, about his father who had been a trapper, and his mother who had been the most practical woman he had ever known until he met Sarah, which he said in a perfectly matter-of-fact way that made her go very still for a moment. She told him about Missouri, about the town she had grown up in, about learning medicine from the old German doctor there, a man named Brower who had taught her everything he knew because he had no sons and no apprentices, and he said knowledge ought not to die with its owner. She told him about Daniel, really told him, not the widow's shortened version but the real one, the one where Daniel Talmadge had been funny and stubborn and had laughed at his own jokes before he finished them, and how his death had been slow and terrible, and how she had sat with him through every hour of it and held his hand at the end. Jasper listened to all of this with the whole of his attention, not the polite surface attention of social listening but the real kind, the kind that costs something, and when she finished he said quietly, "He sounds like a man worth grieving." "He was," she said. "You have made his land worth something," he said. "That is not nothing." "No," she said. "It is not nothing." The afternoon light moved across the floor between them, golden and slow, and the cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and pine and the last of the coffee, and outside the snow blazed in the sun like something sacred. That evening, with the stove burning low and the lamp casting its warm globe of light, she changed the dressing on a scrape on his forearm that had been threatening to fester. She had been watching it, and he sat very still while she worked, and the silence between them was the kind that is full rather than empty. Her fingers were careful and practiced on his arm, and his arm was very steady under her hands. When she finished, he did not move away immediately, and neither did she. "Sarah," he said very quietly. She looked up. "I want to ask you something, and you do not have to answer it now or ever," he said, "but I need to ask it because not asking it would be dishonest, and I am not willing to be dishonest with you." She waited. "When we get out of here," he said, "would you be willing to let me call on you properly? In town, in the daylight," he paused, "because I would like to know you beyond a blizzard." Sarah Talmadge looked at Jasper Hunter in the lamplight of a one-room trapper's cabin in the Wyoming Territory, 5 days into November, and she felt the complicated machinery of her practical heart make a sound it had not made in 4 years, something between a protest and a welcome. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." He nodded once slowly as though he had received news of significant importance and was giving it its proper weight. "Good," he said, and that was all, but it was more than enough. They rode out the next morning, Copper carrying Sarah through snow that was knee-deep on the horse and occasionally deeper, Jasper on foot beside her on his long legs because his own horse was long gone, and they had to move slowly anyway. He had fashioned rough snowshoes from branches and strips of leather from a worn-out harness he found in the lean-to, and they worked well enough, though not elegantly, and she did not say this, but she thought it was clever and resourceful and entirely characteristic of everything she had come to know about him in 5 days. It took most of the day to reach Caldwell Creek. The town materialized out of the white afternoon light like something half imagined, the church steeple, the false front of the general store, the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, and Sarah felt the familiar complicated tug of home, affection and relief, and the faint sadness of returning to ordinariness. At the edge of town, Jasper stopped. "I will go to the livery," he said, "and see about getting a horse back to the rocking age. You could stay one night," she said, keeping her voice casual. "My neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, runs a room. You should not ride 15 miles in this snow on a borrowed horse after what you have been through." He looked at her sideways, and there was something in his expression that was warm and slightly amused. "Are you prescribing rest, Mrs. Talmadge?" "I am," she said. "Medically." "Well," he said, "if it is medical." He stayed 2 nights, which was medically appropriate. On the second evening, she had him to supper at her small house. The first time in 4 years she had cooked for someone who was not a patient, and she made a beef stew from a cut she bought at the butcher's shop because she wanted something proper, something that was not crisis cooking. He noticed the extra effort without making it awkward, complimenting the meal with the same directness he brought to everything, and afterward they sat by her small fireplace and talked until the fire burned low. He left the next morning on a horse borrowed from the livery, and he turned back once at the end of the street and touched the brim of his hat, and she was standing in the doorway of her house in the cold morning air, and she raised one hand and something passed between them across that distance that was entirely legible and entirely new. He came back on a Saturday, 6 days later, riding his own horse, a big gray gelding he called Smoke, and he came to her door in the afternoon with his hat in his hands and his hair combed, and said he had come to town on some business and wondered if she might like to take a walk. They walked for an hour along the frozen creek at the edge of town, talking easily, walking close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, and at the end of it, when he helped her over a slippery bank, she kept his hand a beat longer than necessary and he let her, and they both pretended this was normal. He came the following Saturday, and the one after. By December, the town had entirely ceased to pretend that it had not noticed, which was fine by Sarah, who had never much cared for pretending. Old Bill Pierce at the general store said, when she came in for flour, "I hear that Hunter boy is coming around regular, Mrs. Talmadge," with an entirely unconcealed delight, and she said, "He is, Mr. Pierce," and left it at that, but she was smiling when she walked out. He was not a man who rushed things, and she was not a woman who would have tolerated rushing. What they were building was something slow and honest and deliberate, and each Saturday brought them slightly closer to some threshold they were both approaching with care. December brought more snow, and with it the particular social architecture of a small frontier town in winter, church socials and neighbor visits, and the Christmas gathering at the schoolhouse that served as both celebration and mutual endurance exercise. Jasper came to the Christmas gathering with her, which was noted and discussed by everyone present, and they sat together at one of the long tables and ate the communal supper that a dozen women had contributed to, and she introduced him to her neighbors as a friend, and he shook hands and was easy and direct with everyone without being performative about it. On the walk home through the bitter cold, their breath making clouds in the darkness, she said, "You are very good with people." "I like people," he said simply. Most of them." "Most of them," she agreed. "You are skeptical of them," he said. "I have seen a great many of them at their worst," she said. "Sick people are sometimes unkind. Yet you keep treating them." "Yes," she said, "because being unkind when you are frightened is a very human thing to be. I do not hold it against them afterward." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her in the cold, and then he said, "That is a particular kind of grace." "It is a particular kind of practicality," she said. "Both," he said. "It is both." She stopped walking. They were a block from her house, the snow muffling every sound in the world, the stars hard and brilliant overhead. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and she said, "Jasper." "Sarah," he said. "I want to say something clearly," she said, because she had never been a woman who expressed things by implication if direct speech was available. "Go ahead," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady. "I am not a young woman who needs someone to take care of her," she said. "I have built something here. I have a life and a purpose, and I am not looking to be completed by someone else." She paused. "But I am very aware that since the blizzard I have been noticeably happier, and I am a practical enough person to know why, and I think you ought to know that I know." He looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, and something in his face was absolutely still and absolutely certain. "I am not looking to complete you," he said. "I am looking to stand beside you. There is a difference." She felt that below her breastbone again, that specific warmth. "Yes," she said, "there is." He reached out and took her gloved hand in his, and they stood in the snowy street in the cold, and the dark, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. January and February passed in the way that Wyoming Territory winters pass, slow and cold and demanding, punctuated by sudden small warmths. He came every Saturday without fail, weather permitting, and when the weather did not permit, he sent a note with whoever was riding toward town, and she kept the notes in the drawer of her kitchen table with a casualness that did not fool her for a moment. There were things that happened in those months that deepened what was between them, beyond the purely romantic. A diphtheria outbreak hit the town in late January, 3 children sick, one very badly, and she worked without sleep for 4 days. And on the third day Jasper arrived, having heard about it from a writer. And without being asked, he made himself useful in the way a capable man does in a crisis, fetching water and firewood and food for the families, sitting with frightened fathers who needed someone calm, handling the 100 practical things that needed handling so that she could focus on the medicine. All 3 children survived. Afterward, when the crisis was over and she was sitting at her kitchen table with her head in her hands from sheer exhaustion, he set a cup of hot coffee in front of her and sat across from her and said nothing at all, because he understood that she did not need words right then. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held on, and that was its own kind of conversation. He also saw the harder things about the territory in those months, the injustices that Sarah had been navigating for years, and that she was never quite able to stop noticing. A Shoshone woman named Pale Reed, who sometimes came to Sarah for medicines, quiet, dignified, utterly composed, was refused service at the general store one morning when Sarah happened to be present, told flatly by Mr. Pierce's assistant that they did not serve Indians. Sarah had put down her own purchases and looked at the young man steadily and said that Mr. Pierce had better come out and speak with her himself, because she was about to take her considerable business to the dry goods in Laramie. Mr. Pierce came out and was, under this pressure, suddenly able to find it appropriate to serve Pale Reed after all. Jasper, who had been waiting by the door, said nothing until they were outside and then said, "You do that often." "When it comes up," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father traded with the Comanche for 10 years. They treated him fairly and he tried to return the same." He paused. "It does not fix the larger wrong." "No," she said, "it does not, but small wrongs are the ones I can reach." He nodded, and something in his expression was the same thing she had seen in his eyes in the cabin when he first looked at her, that focused, serious, genuine attention. March arrived with its particular cruelty, the kind of not quite spring that the territory specialized in, cold mornings and treacherous false thaws and mud that went down to China. The snow was beginning its slow retreat from the south-facing slopes, and the creek was making the first tentative sounds of movement under its ice. One Saturday in mid-March, Jasper arrived later than usual, and he was quieter than usual, and she could see something working in him, not unhappiness exactly, more like a man who has arrived at a decision and is determining how to present it honestly. They walked, as they often did, and when they had gone far enough from town that the sound of it had faded, he stopped and turned to face her and said, "I need to tell you something, and I would like you to let me finish it before you respond." "All right," she said. "The Rocking H is letting 3 men go at the end of the month," he said. "The owner is consolidating. I am one of the 3. I knew it was coming. The business is changing, as I told you. I have enough saved to buy that land I have been thinking about, but I need to decide where and whether to stay in this territory." He paused. "There is land available near Caldwell Creek. 40 acres on the north side of the creek, good soil, access to water. I can afford it and work it alone, at least at the start." He stopped. "I want to know if staying near Caldwell Creek is something you would be glad of." Sarah Talmadge looked at Jasper Hunter in the gray and gold light of a Wyoming March morning, and she thought, as she sometimes did, of Daniel, and felt the clean, clear, bittersweet truth of grief that is not a wound anymore but a scar. And she thought of the one-room cabin in the blizzard and the way he had looked at her across the tin cup of fever tea. And she thought of the way he had held her hand in the snowy street in December without saying a word. And she thought of the drawer in her kitchen table with its collection of small, folded notes. "I would be very glad of it," she said. He exhaled, and it was the exhale of a man who has been holding a great deal very carefully, and he reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back under her hat with a gesture so tender and unself-conscious that it went directly through her ribs. "Then I will buy it," he said. He bought it in the first week of April, when the mud had firmed enough to ride and the land office in Caldwell Creek was open for business. He signed the papers on a Tuesday, and Sarah was present because he had asked her if she would be. And afterward she shook the land agent's hand alongside him and felt something she had not felt since before Daniel died, the sense of a future being built in real time, with real hands, in the actual present. The land itself was beautiful in the way that Wyoming land is beautiful starkly, honestly, without ornament. The creek ran along the southern edge of the property, not yet fully thawed, speaking in the complicated language of cold water over stone, and there were cottonwoods along the bank that would be magnificent in summer. The northern section rose into a gentle slope of meadow grass that was just beginning to show the first faint green of spring beneath the retreating snow. There was no house yet. He would need to build it, or have it built, which would take most of the summer. But there was the land, solid and real under the April sky. They walked the perimeter of it together that first day after the purchase, moving through the last patches of snow and the mud and the pale early grass, and she pointed out where the creek bank was most stable, and he noted where the slope would provide the best shelter for a house foundation, and they talked about it practically and concretely, with the particular pleasure of two people planning something they both intend to be present for. At the top of the north slope, where you could see across the meadow to the creek below and the town of Caldwell Creek beyond, he stopped and looked out at all of it for a long moment, and then looked at her. "I want to ask you something else," he said. She turned. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the land or the house or any practical reason at all, because I have been looking at you since November, and every time I look I see something I want to look at for the rest of my life." He paused. "And because I think you are the most capable and most brave and most genuinely kind person I have ever met. And I know what I am asking is considerable because you have a life here that is entirely your own, and I want you to know that I am not asking you to give any part of that up. I am asking to be added to it." She stood in the April wind on the north slope of 40 acres in Wyoming Territory and looked at this man who had come into her life through a blizzard and a fever and a one-room cabin and 5 days of snow, and she knew with the clean certainty of a bone that is set correctly that the answer was yes. "Yes," she said. "Jasper Hunter, yes." He crossed to her in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, there on the slope above the creek in the early April wind, and she kissed him back with the whole of herself. Not the carefully managed, practically proportioned version of herself she generally offered the world, but all of it, the grief and the stubbornness and the capacity for love that she had been keeping in reserve for 4 years like something too valuable to spend. When they parted she was slightly out of breath and he was smiling the real smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she said, "You are considerably better at that than I expected." "You thought about it," he said. "I have been thinking about it since approximately the 4th day of the blizzard," she said, "when you made the snowshoes from the harness leather." He laughed then, a real laugh, full and surprised and entirely delighted, and she thought she could listen to that sound for the rest of her life without tiring of it. They were married on the 15th of May, 1883, in the Caldwell Creek church that was barely more than a dressed-up wooden box with a cross nailed to the front, by the Reverend Solomon Parks, who was a large, cheerful man from Georgia who had ended up in Wyoming by a series of events he described as providential, and everyone else described as improbable. Half the town came to the wedding, more than half, really, because there was not much that brought Caldwell Creek together in quite the same spirit as a wedding, and Sarah Talmadge's wedding in particular was treated as a community event of the highest order. Mrs. Calloway cried. Bill Pierce at the general store brought a bottle of rye whiskey of questionable vintage as a gift and pronounced it the best marriage since his own, which his wife, standing beside him, received with an expression of affectionate skepticism. Sarah wore her best dress, which was green wool because she was a practical woman, and a white dress in Wyoming Territory was a fantasy best left to women with more laundry days than she had. And it suited her, suited the directness of her face and the dark of her hair, and the particular kind of beauty that does not announce itself but simply is. Jasper wore his good suit, which was not extravagant but was clean and pressed, and he had clearly been thoughtful about his appearance in a way that touched her more than any finery would have. He said his vows in a voice that was completely level and completely sincere, looking at her the entire time, and she said hers the same way. And when Reverend Parks said they were married and Jasper took her face in his hands again and kissed her, the assembled citizens of Caldwell Creek made a sound of collective satisfaction that was almost musical. The reception was held in the open air behind the church because it was May and warm enough if you forgave the wind, which in Wyoming you always had to, and there was food from a dozen kitchens, and dancing to a fiddle player named Pete Granger, who played 3 songs he knew very well and the rest with considerable enthusiasm if variable accuracy. Sarah danced with her husband, which was a phrase she was still getting used to in the best possible way, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned on trail drives from a Mexican vaquero named Luis, who had believed that a man who could not dance properly was a man with a deficiency of soul. "And were you a good student?" she asked. "Luis thought I was a lost cause," he said, turning her neatly, "but I have improved in the intervening years." She laughed and pressed closer to him, and the fiddle played and the May sky went slowly gold above them. Summer was, without question, the most joyful season of Sarah's life in Wyoming, and she had had some good summers. They were building, literally and figuratively. The house on the 40 acres went up through June and July, built by Jasper with help from 2 neighboring homesteaders and occasional labor hired from town. And Sarah came out on weekends and evenings to watch its progress and contribute to decisions about layout and space, with a specificity that Jasper seemed to find not annoying but admirable, which made her feel quite fond of him all over again every time. It was a proper house by the standards of the territory, 2 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a real stone fireplace that Jasper laid himself over 3 weekends with the particular obsessive care of a man who understands that a fireplace is the life of a house. She specified a larger window in the kitchen than the original plan had called for because she needed light to work by, and he altered the framing without complaint and without commentary, just made the change and showed her the result with the quiet satisfaction of a man who likes to solve problems. She kept her house in town. This was a practical decision and a personal one. She needed to be accessible to her patients, some of whom came at 3 in the morning with sick children or injuries, and the ride from the homestead was not always possible in bad weather. He understood this completely and without reservation. On weekdays she slept in town and worked and was the person Caldwell Creek needed her to be, and on most weekends she was at the homestead, and their life together was not the conventional shape of a frontier marriage, but it was the shape that fit what they actually were, and it worked. He started a small herd through the summer, a dozen cattle purchased at the end of the cattle season, the beginning of what he intended to build carefully over years. He also planted a kitchen garden in the good soil on the east side of the house, which produced squash and beans, and a prodigious quantity of potatoes that fall that they were eating in various configurations for months. She brought her preserving knowledge to bear on the summer harvest, and they put up more food than the two of them could eat in 2 winters, which was the correct way to live in the territory. There were hard things that summer, too. A cattle rancher named Vernon Coates, who ran one of the larger spreads north of Caldwell Creek, had a running dispute with 2 small homesteaders about grazing rights on the open range west of town. Coates was not a violent man exactly, but he was a powerful one, and he was used to small landowners eventually yielding to him, and he hired a man who was known to be unpleasant to make his arguments for him. There were broken fences and some damaged crops, and 2 of the homesteader families came to Sarah frightened and asking what could be done. What was done in the end was something both mundane and effective. Sarah organized a meeting of all the small landowners in the area, held at the church, and wrote a careful letter to the Territorial Land Office laying out the legal situation, which was actually on the side of the homesteaders if you read the grants correctly. Jasper rode to Cheyenne with the letter personally, because he had contacts with a lawyer there through his cattle work, and the legal challenge stuck. Coates backed off, as powerful men do when they are made to confront formal consequences, and the homesteader families kept their land. Coates was never friendly to Jasper after that, which Jasper remarked on with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had never expected powerful men to be his particular friends. "You did the right thing," Sarah said. "We did the right thing," he said. "Do not edit yourself out of that." By September, with the house finished and the harvest in and the first cold edge beginning to return to the morning air, Sarah admitted to herself what she had been quietly suspecting for several weeks. She confirmed it carefully, with the professional thoroughness she brought to everything, and then she sat with the information alone for one evening before telling him, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted the time to feel it privately first, the complicated layering of joy and awe and the particular vulnerability of wanting something this much. She told him on a Sunday morning. They were in the kitchen of the homestead, which smelled of coffee and wood smoke, the morning light coming through the larger window she had insisted on and falling across the table where he was eating. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, "I need to tell you something." He set his cup down and gave her his complete attention. "I am expecting," she said, "a baby, in the spring, I think." The look on his face was she would think about it later and not quite have adequate words for it. It was joy, certainly, deep and immediate and unguarded, but it was also something very like reverence, and something that was plainly the specific emotion of a man who did not take things for granted. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and pressed them to his lips, and when he looked up at her his eyes were bright. "Sarah," he said. "I know," she said. Are you well? Is everything is fine," she said. "I am a healer, Jasper. I know what to watch for. I am perfectly well." He stood up and pulled her into his arms with a care that had strength behind it, the way he held things he valued, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating fast and certain. And outside the September morning was crisp and gold, and the cattle grazed on the slope below the house, and the creek sang quietly at the edge of the land, and the world felt very large and very good. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was cold but not cruel, not like the blizzard November that had brought them together. Sarah worked through it with the adjustments that pregnancy required, attended by her own careful knowledge, and Jasper watched over her with an attentiveness that was protective without being suffocating. He had clearly decided that his role was to be available and capable without being hovering, which was the correct decision, and she loved him for it. There were conversations over those winter evenings that she stored carefully in memory. Long, slow talks by the fireplace about what kind of people they wanted to raise, about the territory and its future, about what they believed in and what they found beautiful, and what kept them awake. He told her once that before that November blizzard he had been feeling something he could only describe as unmoored, not unhappy, but without direction, as though his life were a ship that was moving without a destination. "And now?" she asked. He looked across the fire at her. "Now I know where I am," he said simply. She went back to her house in town through November and December, when her presence was needed. A bad winter cold swept through the town in December, and she was busy for 3 weeks straight. But by January, she was spending most of her time at the homestead, with Mrs. Calloway promising to send word if anyone needed her urgently. Jasper rode to town and back frequently, keeping the supply lines open, navigating the cold Wyoming landscape with the competence he brought to everything physical. The baby arrived on the 6th of March, 1884, in the homestead's upstairs loft, attended by Sarah herself, and by Mrs. Calloway, who had been summoned 3 days prior when the timing became clear. It was a boy, a healthy, substantial, emphatically present boy with his father's dark hair, and a pair of lungs that announced his arrival to the entirety of the north end of the property. Jasper, who had been managing the waiting with impressive composure for approximately 18 hours, came up the loft stairs at the sound of the first cry and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that Sarah, for all her facility with words, could not have described except to say that it was entirely new. She had never seen that particular expression on any face before. "Come and meet him," she said. He crossed the room and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the instinctive, careful strength of a man who understood how to handle things that mattered, and he looked down at his son for a long moment without speaking. "Thomas," he said finally. It was the name they had agreed on in December, after Sarah's grandfather, who had been a doctor in Missouri, and had given her her first anatomy book when she was 12 years old. "Thomas," she confirmed. Jasper looked up at her, and the expression on his face was still that entirely new thing, and also the most legible thing she had ever seen. And she reached up and touched his jaw with the back of her fingers and felt the stubble and the warmth and the steady aliveness of him. Mrs. Calloway, descending the stairs with admirable discretion, was heard to remark to no one in particular that she had not seen such a look on a man's face since her own husband had met their first child 30 years past, and that some things were worth coming out in the cold for. The spring of 1884 came to the Wyoming Territory with the particular splendor of a spring that has been earned, and to Sarah and Jasper Hunter, it came with the specific, daily wonder of a new person in the world who was learning it from the beginning. Thomas was a vigorous, curious, demanding baby who grew with the speed that good land and good care produce, and who by summer was holding his head up with the proprietary confidence of someone who has decided he likes the view. Life arranged itself into a new shape around him, as it always does, as it must, and the shape was good. Sarah continued her work slightly modified, with Thomas accompanying her in a sling for his first months, and then staying at the homestead with his father on days she rode to town, because Jasper had arranged his work to be present when she was absent, the kind of practical partnership that people talked about but rarely achieved. He was, as it turned out, as capable a father as he was everything else patient in the specific, individual way of someone who is paying attention to the actual child in front of him, rather than a general idea of a child. There were neighbors by then, more of them. The territory was filling in, the open range shrinking, families and single men staking claims and building houses within riding distance of the Hunter homestead. Some of them Sarah had treated, some of them Jasper had helped with fencing or building, or the 100 practical exchanges that made frontier life possible. They had become, without particularly planning it, the kind of household that others gravitated toward, not because they were prosperous or prominent, but because the house on the north slope of the creek felt like a place where things were steady and true. The autumn of 1884 was when Jasper proposed the extension to the house, a third ground-floor room to serve as Sarah's proper medical room, with shelving and work surfaces built to her specifications, so that patients who needed to come to her could do so at the homestead on days she could not be in town. She looked at the plans he had drawn, rough but accurate, and said it was exactly right, and he said he had been thinking about it since January and had wanted to make sure the dimensions were practical before proposing it. "You measure twice," she said, "and cut once," he said. "My father's rule." "He was a wise man," she said. "He would have liked you very much," Jasper said. "You are exactly the kind of woman he would have approved of." "What kind is that?" she asked. "The kind that knows what she thinks and does what she says and does not pretend to be less than she is for the comfort of people who ought to be able to manage the truth." He paused. "And excellent at stew." "Jasper Hunter," she said. "Sarah Hunter," he said, and the sound of her name now, her chosen name, added to and not replaced, was still something she loved the sound of 2 years on. He built the medical room over 3 weekends in October, with help from 2 of their neighbors, and she equipped it over the following weeks with the focused pleasure of a person who has been given exactly the tool they needed. Pale Reed, the Shoshone woman who had become something like a friend in the way that 2 women in a territory with few women become friends, came to see it and looked around at the shelves and the clean surfaces and the window Sarah had positioned for maximum morning light, and said in her quiet, direct way, "This is proper work." "Yes," Sarah said, "it is." The second child, a girl they named Ruth, arrived in October of 1885, and she was from her first hour a person of vivid and definite personality, which her father looked upon with the expression of a man who expects nothing less, and her brother, now 18 months old, regarded with the cautious interest of someone assessing a new and uncertain element in his territory. Thomas adored her within a week. He would bring her things, a wooden rattle, a smooth stone, whatever was in reach, with the proprietary generosity of someone who has decided that this small person is his responsibility and also quite interesting. Jasper watched this with a quiet contentment that Sarah associated with his best moods, the settled, grateful kind. The years settled into themselves. 1886, 1887. The territory was changing, the open range was nearly gone, the railroad was opening more towns, more families were coming. Caldwell Creek grew. A real doctor arrived in 1886, a young man from Pennsylvania named Dr. August Wells, and Sarah met him with a complex emotion that she recognized as relief partially, and something else partially, the particular ambivalence of a person who has been essential and is no longer quite so essential. She handled it with the practicality she handled everything with. They became colleagues, dividing the work sensibly, each respecting the other's knowledge, and he was honest enough to admit that her practical experience far exceeded his textbook training in several areas. The herd on the Hunter homestead had grown to 40 head by the autumn of 1887, and Jasper had taken on one hired hand, a quiet young man from Nebraska named Cal Wheeler, who was earnest and capable and treated Thomas with the admiring attention that small boys require from young men. The 40 acres were not empire. They were not meant to be. They were exactly enough to be real, enough to be worth the work, enough to anchor a life to. On a November evening in 1887, exactly 5 years from the blizzard, Sarah found herself standing at the window of the homestead's main room, looking out at the first early snow of the season coming down soft and unhurried in the last light of afternoon, and she thought about the one-room cabin on the hillside that had probably by now been absorbed entirely back into the landscape, its mud chinking fallen away, and its logs returning to the ground. She thought about the woman she had been when she pushed through that door, capable and grieving and entirely alone, braced against the world with both hands. Jasper came and stood beside her. He had Thomas on one hip. Their son, now 5, had been demanding a story for the past 10 minutes and had evidently found the most direct route to getting one. Ruth was asleep upstairs in her small bed. The kitchen smelled of supper, and the fire in the great stone fireplace made the room warm and orange gold, and outside the snow came down on the land that was theirs. "First snow," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her sideways with the particular attention he had always had for her, the noticing eyes, the whole of his focus available to her whenever she turned toward it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned from the window and looked at him, at this man she had known through fever and blizzard and grief and joy and the daily cumulative miracle of ordinary life, and said, "I am thinking about a very cold November and a very bad storm and a very fortunate piece of bad luck." He shifted Thomas to his other hip and reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture he had made 100 times now, always with the same gentleness, always with the same intent attention. "The best bad luck I ever had," he said. Thomas, with the impeccable timing of a 5-year-old, said, "Papa, what is bad luck?" Jasper looked at his son and then at his wife, and the smile, the real one, the one that changed everything, crossed his face. "It is when something difficult happens," he said to Thomas, "and it turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you." Thomas considered this with the deep seriousness of a child processing complex philosophy. "Like when I fell off the fence and Mama fixed my arm and then you let me have cake." "Exactly like that," Jasper said. Sarah laughed, which started Thomas laughing, which caused Ruth to call out in drowsy protest from upstairs, and Jasper went to tell the boy his story while Sarah went up to settle the girl back to sleep. Moving through the warm lit rooms of the house they had built together with the particular kind of ease that is not carelessness, but its opposite, the ease of knowing exactly where you are and choosing to be there. Later, after the children were asleep and the supper things were cleared, they sat together by the fire in the way they had learned to sit together over years, close and easy, her feet tucked up beside her, his arm around her shoulders, the fire burning down to coals. The snow was still coming down outside, soft and steady, covering the land in its patient way. She was thinking about the one-room cabin again, about the lamp on the table and the fever tea, and the way they had talked in the dark with the storm howling outside. Two strangers becoming something else entirely without quite noticing the moment it happened. She was thinking about the morning the storm stopped and she had stood in the doorway and felt that first faint reluctance, that pull, and had not known yet what it was pulling toward. Now she knew. "Jasper," she said. He said, the sound of a man deeply comfortable. "Are you glad we stayed?" she said. And she did not mean the cabin, or not only the cabin. She meant all of it, the territory, the 40 acres, the life that had been built here out of blizzard and luck and stubbornness and love. He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him turn the question over with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "I am glad," he said, "every single day." She leaned closer into his warmth, and outside the snow continued its ancient work, covering the world in white, and the fire held against the cold, and the house was full of the breathing of sleeping children and the sound of the creek below, still moving, even now, even in winter, steady under the ice, always finding its way forward. The following spring came in the way all Wyoming springs came, with mud and wind and sudden warm days that felt like a reprieve from a sentence, and the creek broke its ice in a rush of cold, bright water, and the cottonwoods along the bank put out their first tender leaves, and the meadow above turned from the pale gold of dead winter grass to the first hesitant green of growth. Thomas ran through that grass with the pure physical joy of a child who has been indoors for months and needs to reacquaint himself with the concept of open space, and Ruth toddled after him with a determination that had always been characteristic of her, refusing assistance and occasionally landing in the mud with a philosophical equanimity that both her parents recognized as a family trait. Jasper watched them from the fence post he was mending, and Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, and they looked at each other across the yard in the clear spring light, and the look was the entire conversation. Everything they had survived, everything they had built. The blizzard and the fever and the long winters and the small daily heroics of a life in the territory. The children and the land and the herd and the house with its proper medical room and its large kitchen window and its fireplace laid in stone by careful hands. The cattle and the neighbors and the town and the 40 acres that were solid and real and permanently, legally, inarguably theirs. Neither of them had been ready to leave that first spring. Neither of them was ready to leave now. And the beauty of it, the particular, clear, unambiguous beauty of the life they had made, was that they did not have to. Ruth fell down in the mud and came up laughing, mud on her face and both hands and the front of her dress, triumphant. Thomas offered her his hand, which she took, and they went running again across the greening meadow above the creek, two small figures in the vast spring light of the Wyoming Territory, and the sky above them was the blue of something permanent and true. Sarah stepped out of the doorway and walked across the yard to where Jasper stood at the fence, and he turned when she came near and made room for her beside him in the way he always made room, naturally, easily, the way a person makes room for something that belongs there. She took his hand. He held on. Below them the creek ran clear and cold over its stones, saying the thing water always says in spring, which is that everything that seemed stopped was only waiting, and everything that seemed lost was only changed, and the world was turning as it always had and always would. And here, in this particular piece of it, there were two people who had found each other in the dark and the cold and had held on, and the spring that had come after the blizzard had kept on coming, year after year. Faithful and bright and always, always worth the wait.